Welcome back to, we call this the Wednesday Word Wad. It's kind of our little joke. We have Jaden here. He's joining us today, and we are going to be talking about the difference between isometric, concentric, and eccentric, whether it be training or portions of each rep, each
Yep.
set, each lift. Right?
There we go.
Cool. Mike, do you want to start off with kind of explaining the different, maybe give an example of an exercise and like the difference between the three?
Yeah, so simply put, the eccentric is when the muscle is experiencing the stretch or the lengthening phase. So we'll take the bench press as an example. You unrack as the bar descends towards your chest. That is the eccentric. The prime mover, the pecs are lengthening or stretching. The concentric is when the muscle shortens. So that would be on the bench press, pushing the weight up. And then isometrics are just static holds where there's no dynamic portion. So you're just kind of staying in a fixed position, tensing, flexing, holding it. Example of that would be like the core's roll within a plank.
Plank, wall sit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Anything to add to that?
The isometric could also be a part of your bench press. You could iso hold on the chest or iso hold at the top. It's also a part of any kind of movement, not necessarily a specific movement that you are going to call an isometric, like a wall sit or a plank.
Mm-hmm.
Sweet.
Yeah. Cool. Now, Mike, what portion of each kind of rep, the eccentric, concentric, or isometric, elicits the most muscle growth?
Yeah, so I think typically, and there's more and more research coming out, that training to full range of motion and applying tension within a full range of motion is going to help maximize hypertrophy as long as you're training close to failure. Mm-hmm. Now, the eccentric portion seems to elicit a bit more pure stimulus, but at the same token, if you're going really slow on the eccentric, you're going to end up doing less reps. Mm-hmm. So it kind of balances out. So there was a push by some fitness enthusiast scientists that were really trying to have people kind of put a lot of emphasis on that slow eccentric because technically speaking, there is a little bit more muscle growth. But if that completely plummets performance, then it's kind of like a net even. At the same token, we also have to factor in the fatigue cost. If you're doing constantly slow eccentrics, that fatigue will accumulate and decrease the total stimulus that you can provide. So in practical terms, from what I've read, you want your eccentrics to be consistent so that they fall within specificity so that you have good data collection when you're training. Typically 2 to 7 seconds is what I recommend for eccentrics per movement, and you're just kind of keeping it constant. Now that duration may be different depending on the movement. If a movement has a ton of range of motion, there's just a further distance to let the muscle stretch through. The eccentric might be a little bit longer. If it's an exercise where there really isn't as much range of motion, like a hip thrust, you're not doing slow-mo 7-second eccentric hip thrust. Yeah. And that's not a very length and bias movement anyways. So yeah, I would say it depends.
Yeah. So you said that certain movements elicit a little bit more like fatigue and in relation to like the volume, you're going to be limited to the amount of reps based on the eccentric in the time.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. So if you do like 6 reps with slow eccentrics versus 12 reps with faster eccentrics, at the end of the day, if you're training the same proximity to failure, it's probably going to give you the same training effect. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same token, you don't want to rush your eccentrics because the risk of injury seems to go up a little bit higher, especially if you're rushing through that, it's called the amortization phase or the in-between of the eccentric and the concentric. One of the reasons I really like the eccentric, kind of going back to my first point, is the stretch with tons of tension when the muscle's in the stretch position seems to elicit a ton of hypertrophy. If you are going controlled eccentrics, by the time you get to that maximal stretch position, you're going to be able to kind of like hold that for a slight count and then go up. Whereas if you're going down fast on the eccentric and then all of a sudden you're trying to quickly break, you have a risk of injury, misgrooving the weight of whatever you're doing. It's not going to be as effective. So example would be you're driving a car. It's recommended. You see the red light coming up, slowly slow down. Now, there's some people that for some reason they think that they'll get to their destination faster if they like sprint to the red light and then just slam on the brakes.
Yeah.
Guess what? That's a lot of fatigue cost on those brakes.
Yeah.
You're probably going to be at AAA more often. I know this because I've had to replace my brakes a couple of times. The metaphor does apply in this case to sports training, specifically for hypertrophy. So if we know that stretch and tension at the amortization phase seems to induce a lot of hypertrophy, it would make sense to kind of be slow as you get down to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mike's not saying that we're similar to a car, and like humans are similar to a car in the sense of like we're a machine, because machines can't adapt and we can.
Correct.
Unless you're some crazy AI. And
I was going to say the cars of the future are probably going to right. adapt pretty well.
So I wanted to kind of lead that question to, do you think that there is like an ROI to certain exercises focusing on the eccentric? Like I know for sure that like if you are trying to work towards that kind of a deadlift, focusing on the eccentric of a deadlift where you're typically at a higher percentage work, higher exertion, and you're focusing on the eccentric portion versus like an RDL where it could be anywhere 50 to several hundred pounds lighter, because you're focusing on that kind of hypertrophy or muscle gain with the RDL versus the strength gain with the deadlift. Are there some exercises that are better to kind of really emphasize that eccentric?
So I think if you're using the deadlift as a tool for improving your deadlift, specifically for like powerlifting, then you're probably, maybe if you're in a hypertrophy phase, it would make sense to do controlled eccentrics. Otherwise, if you're peaking for the meet, controlled eccentrics, that fatigue cost would not warrant the amount of stimulus you would get in terms of increasing the magnitude of your total deadlift. So in that case, I wouldn't do it. But if you're doing like a RDL all the way down to the ground and you're using it as a tool to build your hamstrings and get them a lot bigger, then I definitely would control the eccentric all the way to the ground. It makes reps more predictable. It's easier to keep the technique constant. And the other reason I really love controlled eccentrics is because RIR or RPE gets a lot more predictable. When you're lifting fast, sometimes you lose focus. Sometimes it's hard to predict when you're close to failure, and then technique starts to get really weird or wonky. Like if I get to the top of a rep and then I know I'm going to be going down slowly, I've had that entire lowering portion to kind of think about how hard will my next rep be. Whereas if I'm going fast, I don't have that time to really think about, okay, will I actually be able to accomplish this or not?
Cool.
So,
I believe it was last week, Jaden, I saw you doing some sort of banded, more of an explosive banded like back extension on the GHD. I noticed that there was a large emphasis on the concentric and kind of the isometric at that kind of hip extension phase. You want to explain why you were focusing on the concentric and isometric more than the eccentric portion?
Yeah, honestly, recently I've been digging a lot into sort of the Jay Schroeder line of thinking and some athlete performance stuff from the early 2000s and kind of the evolution of that with sort of Dan Fichter, Chris Korfis, stuff like that. And really just playing around with that, seeing how my concentric reps felt after doing the long isometric. And I just kind of add, as far as the eccentric stuff, if we were to consider that more from a sports performance standpoint instead of a hypertrophy one, then there may be more of a place for those quicker eccentrics, because that's something you have to do in sports, is be ready to stop and go rather quickly.
The deceleration.
Yeah. So, there's certainly times a year where in athletic performance, you might want to do your long duration, heavy eccentrics. And then there's other times a year where, you need to be peaking to be ready to stop and go quickly. And you might do some quicker eccentric work as well.
Cool. And so where would you kind of apply that based on, would you be focusing more on the eccentrics in the off season when you might be trying to gain mass and kind of build or increase performance in whatever lift you're trying to do and get prepared for the season? And then, or would you kind of implement that year round, or is there some sort of phasic kind of approach to that?
It's definitely something that's easier to implement in the off season, just because it may create an extra amount of fatigue in your athletes. if you're someone who has not done a lot of eccentric training before, you can definitely anticipate a lot of muscle soreness for the first couple of sessions that you do that, just because of the way our muscles contract. That creates a lot of extra tearing, which elicits a ton of muscle growth, which is definitely something you want during your off season of any kind of sports performance prep. In season, I would definitely cut out any sort of long duration eccentric. Another awesome thing about eccentric training is you can overload. If I was going to do an eccentric squat, I could take 110% of my back squat, 120% of my back squat, and work on lowering that weight. And that could be something really helpful in a sports performance context as well.
Cool. Mike, anything to agree, disagree, add?
Yeah, I agree that controlled eccentrics definitely induce more muscle damage, coming at a higher fatigue cost, where if you're just overloading the concentric, because the concentric elicits less fatigue, you might be able to handle more within the context of like the sports that you're playing. Maybe the best argument for concentric training then within season 2 is athletes, when the way they move, it's very concentrically based in terms of like locking out joints. Now, at the same token, I don't want to be over sports specific, because sports specificity is all about training the sport itself. The point of the resistance training is to allow you to elicit more force, which then could be turned into power and whatnot. So there is like a balance there.
So then it's also going to be very sport specific, position specific. You think about, even in basketball, you have your big guys who are chasing a lot of rebounds. They're going to be very concentric jumpers. They need to get off the ground very quickly, whereas you have your guards who are maybe going for more layups, dunks. They're jumping off 2 feet. They might want to focus their training more around that eccentric training, so that they're able to load up more and get higher vertical jumps.
Cool. Yeah. Anything to add, Mike?
What do you want to add, Zach?
What do I want to add? Do you think, obviously isometrics have a place, I would say more so in like the sports aspect of things.
Sure.
Do you think that it is, because we've done videos in the past, Jaden, where we've done like overrated, underrated in terms of like equipment, like we like gear, we said gear, but we meant like lifters and knee sleeves and stuff like that. Do you think training for the Gen Pop isometrics are, because I feel like just from seeing on social media and in the gym, isometrics are the least trained. Specifically on purpose, like purposely trained portion of the rep. You might see a lot of people, like your clients will add in like pause bench or pause, like there was like a slight kind of pause on either RDLs or on squats and whatnot. Do you think that isometrics are overrated or underrated?
Yeah, I think they're overrated, because you're getting stronger in one position, and that's it. Where if you're training in a dynamic fashion with an eccentric and a concentric, you're getting stronger in that one position, but also in the infinite positions in between. Now, in isometric, that's like a brief pause in the amortization phase or between the eccentric and the concentric. I think that's brilliant, and I use those a lot. But just doing like long static holds, I think, create a fair amount of fatigue and do not elicit much adaptation at all. Now, if an athlete is having a really hard time, like losing position on movement, sometimes you might add a brief isometric at those places where they're losing position. So an example, the Russians with some of their squats, they'll do something where they like pause halfway down, they pause all the way down, they pause halfway up, then they go all the way down, then they come all the way up. And that's if they notice their hips start to shift backwards or forwards too far on the squat. All of a sudden they're exposed during that pause, and they're able to kind of reallocate or reorient position to get back into that groove. But otherwise, I think like general isometrics are overrated.
And well, that squat you had the Wheaton. You programmed that for the Wheaton
the class
workout, where they went up, pause, went back down, pause, and then all the way up. How did it go again?
So what I liked about pausing halfway down, all the way down, halfway up, all the way down and up, is they're spending extra time in that lengthened state. Which is good for hypertrophy. Also, generally speaking, on a squat, people are weakest like out of the hole. So why not make that part harder to really kind of hammer it down and make that a strength? So when it comes to specificity, you kind of look at a movement. Where are people the weakest? How do we get that positioning strong? Incorporating a brief isometric in that weak position is not a bad idea. Spoto press would be another example. Pausing an inch off the chest, which is a sticking point for a lot of people. That seems to pay dividends. But if you have a top tier athlete that's already really strong and athletic and brilliant at everything, having them do planks, that's like trying to feed a giant gorilla with like a sardine. Like, yeah, maybe it does something, but like, I'd rather go get it some big fish.
Yeah. Two things to kind of finish up. I remember there was some, I can't remember who did the study or what year it came out, but there was something like a max effort like weighted plank. I don't remember what the weight was on the plank, but was very similar stimulus to the midsection as like a 6-rep max back squat. I would have to look up the study, but I remember that being like an emphasis where like some people, it was an argument like, are planks worth it, or should like, or like direct ab work worth it versus just sticking like to the compounds.
Yeah, then I also have to like look at direct ab work is definitely worth it for hypertrophy and for strengthening extension and flexion, because compounds are just like isometric holds. So in that case, for sure worth it. And then a lot of the way that those studies have been done, I'm not like the biggest fan if you're looking at hypertrophy, because they're using EMG research. And EMG research doesn't necessarily like equate to like the amount of mechanical tension and overload that people are getting over time. So that's where it's like looking at a tree in a forest, but you're missing the context of what's really going on and what really drives hypertrophy and strength adaptation.
Cool. Last question for both of you. Now we talked about specificity and kind of the fatigue of eccentrics and the importance of each kind of portion of the rep. Now, do you believe, and you're talking about how focusing on just isometrics are overrated in your opinion, because you're only focusing on one portion of the rep, do you believe that it is worth kind of adding all three, like focusing on all three portions? So maybe it's like a 4-second eccentric on a bench press, pause, and then that nice explosive concentric, so you're focusing on all three? Or should you separate, only focus on the eccentric, 4 or 5-second eccentric, no pause, touch and go, or like which one would elicit more fatigue? Which one do you think it's worth combining all of the portions of the rep, or is it important to kind of separate?
I like to have them all like kind of combined most of the time for most people in most situations. So controlled eccentric, pause, and then up. At the same token, like if someone has a muscle group that can handle a lot of fatigue, I've like force reps could be something viable where you're doing something really heavy, controlling the eccentric and having your spotter lifted up. Now you will get a ton of stimulus, like the raw stimulus magnitude of that is insane. You see a lot of 70s bodybuilders doing it, but the fatigue cost is also really high. I think I've used those with maybe only 2 or 3 athletes, and those athletes are just psychologically like they love it, they crave it. So because they liked it so much, they probably got a lot out of it because they're really trying hard. And they also could recover from a ton of total stimulus, and they only had so much time to train. So we weren't really afraid of the fatigue cost, because we weren't going to get enough stimulus that would cause enough fatigue in otherwise.
Cool.
So in that case, I liked it.
Anything to add, Jan?
Just what really caught my attention is what you said there at the end about programming that for athletes because they craved it and loved it. And at the end of the day, I think one of the most important factors for most athletes is going to be that you're programming something that they can truly invest in because they really enjoy it and they're not dreading their workouts. That's the most important thing for a lot of people.
Like that. Cool.
Sweet.
Good.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See
Boom.
Sweet.